What if Germany's greatest missed opportunity of the war wasn't in Europe, but in the desert stretching toward the Middle East? For a brief moment in 1942, victory at El Alamein could have opened the road to Suez, the Persian oil fields, and a geopolitical shift felt across 3 continents. This is the story of how that gamble came close to reshaping the world, and why it collapsed in the sand. The origins of Germany's interest in the Middle East during the Second World War lay in a complex geopolitical landscape shaped by decades of imperial competition, shifting alliances, and the strategic importance of the region's resources and trade routes. Following the First World War, Britain and France had established mandates across the former Ottoman territories, controlling Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon. These mandates gave the European powers access to vital oil fields, air routes, and supply corridors connecting the Mediterranean to India. Germany, removed from colonial influence after 1918, viewed the Middle East as a region where British authority could be challenged indirectly, especially once direct confrontation in Europe began. By the late 1930s, political unrest in the Middle East created opportunities for external influence. Anti-colonial movements grew in Iraq, Palestine, and Syria, often fueled by dissatisfaction with British or French governance. German intelligence agencies, including the Abwehr and the Foreign Ministry's Arab Bureau, monitored these developments and evaluated potential partners among nationalist leaders. Berlin perceived growing anti-British sentiment as a strategic asset that could be leveraged to destabilize British control over the region's oil supply, particularly the fields near Kirkuk and Mosul, and disrupt land and sea communications with India, which supported British military operations across Asia. Germany's military strategy, however, initially concentrated on Europe. Preparations for the invasion of Poland and subsequent campaigns in Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and France consumed the majority of resources. The Middle East remained a secondary theater, monitored primarily through diplomacy and intelligence rather than direct military deployment. Nonetheless, the outbreak of the war in September 1939 intensified German interest in alternative avenues of pressure. The region's geostrategic value became increasingly evident. The Suez Canal served as one of Britain's primary logistical arteries. The Persian Gulf connected Allied oil production to global naval operations, and the Middle Eastern deserts offered potential corridors linking Axis forces in North Africa with anti-British movements in the Eastern Mediterranean. British intelligence recognized these vulnerabilities early. London reinforced garrisons in Egypt, Iraq, and Palestine, deploying more than 100,000 troops by 1940 to secure critical infrastructure, including the Suez Canal Zone and the oil pipelines running from Iraq to Haifa. Indian Army divisions, RAF squadrons based in Habbaniyah and Cairo, and locally recruited units increased the defensive posture. Reports from the British Middle East Command highlighted concerns about German attempts to exploit political unrest or coordinate with nationalist factions seeking to end British rule. The fall of France in June 1940 intensified these concerns, as Vichy-controlled Syria and Lebanon created new uncertainties regarding control over airfields and transit routes. Germany, observing Britain's overstretched commitments, began evaluating ways to undermine British power using limited resources. Hitler and the German High Command saw the Middle East as a chessboard where Berlin could advance political and military influence indirectly. Early plans focused on forging ties with leaders such as Haj Amin al-Husseini in Palestine and Rashid Ali al-Gailani in Iraq, who sought foreign support for anti-British movements. German assessments argued that a coordinated uprising in Iraq or Palestine could force Britain to divert forces away from North Africa or the Balkans, thereby easing pressure on Axis operations closer to Europe. The Wehrmacht's capacity to intervene directly remained constrained. German forces were heavily engaged on the European continent, and logistical limitations made long-distance deployment to the Middle East highly complex. Nonetheless, Berlin explored multiple avenues of influence. The Luftwaffe examined potential long-range bomber routes through the Caucasus or Vichy Syria, while the Abwehr established networks to supply weapons, funding, and advisors to sympathetic factions across the region. Relations with Italy also shaped Germany's approach. Rome had its own ambitions in the Middle East and East Africa, seeking to expand influence through Libya, Ethiopia, and Somalia. Coordination between German and Italian strategies proved inconsistent, but both powers recognized the importance of undermining British dominance in the region. For the populations of the Middle East, the evolving geopolitical environment created a mixture of uncertainty and opportunity. Some nationalist movements viewed the global conflict as a chance to renegotiate their political futures or weaken colonial authority. Others feared that external powers would turn their territories into battlegrounds for foreign ambitions. British, French, Italian, and German policymakers each interpreted the region through distinct strategic lenses, but none could ignore the economic and political significance of its resources and locations. By early 1941, rising tensions, shifting allegiances, and the unpredictable spread of war set the stage for direct confrontation involving Germany and the Middle East. Although still lacking a unified operational plan, Berlin prepared to exploit any opening that could weaken British control. This convergence of geopolitical interests, military constraints, and political unrest formed the preconditions for Germany's eventual gamble to reshape the balance of power in the region. The active phase of Germany's involvement in the Middle East began in early 1941, when political upheaval in Iraq coincided with shifting military priorities across Europe and North Africa. The central figure in this opening phase was Rashid Ali al-Gailani, a former Iraqi prime minister who opposed British influence and sought to assert greater national autonomy. Supported by elements within the Iraqi army, including the Golden Square group of senior officers, Rashid Ali formed a new government in April 1941. This government rejected further British military presence in the country, challenged existing treaties, and sought external assistance to strengthen Iraq's ability to resist pressure from London. Britain, viewing Iraq as a critical component of its Middle Eastern defense network, reacted with urgency. The Royal Air Force maintained a major base at Habbaniyah, and oil infrastructure in Basra and Kirkuk played a vital role in sustaining Allied operations. British intelligence assessed that the new Iraqi government intended to limit British movement, cut supply lines, and possibly coordinate with Axis powers. To secure their position, British commanders began reinforcing units in Basra and moving additional Indian Army brigades into Iraq. By late April, British forces in the region numbered approximately 40,000 troops, including infantry, armored cars, artillery units, and several RAF squadrons. For Germany, the events in Iraq presented an unexpected opportunity. Although Berlin lacked a concrete operational plan for intervention, the Foreign Ministry and the Abwehr encouraged closer contact with Rashid Ali's government. German diplomats in Ankara and Rome relayed Iraqi requests for military aid. Hitler approved limited support, authorizing the transfer of weapons, funding, and advisors. Yet the strategic situation limited the scale of involvement. Wehrmacht units were preparing for Operation Barbarossa, and Luftwaffe resources were focused on the Balkans and Mediterranean. As a result, Germany's initial response consisted of symbolic gestures rather than large-scale deployments. Small shipments of rifles and machine guns, several military advisors, and plans to send aircraft through Syria once the necessary arrangements could be made with Vichy authorities. The confrontation escalated on April 30, 1941, when Iraqi forces encircled RAF Habbaniyah and demanded that no further British flights take place. British commanders refused and launched preemptive airstrikes on Iraqi positions. The resulting battle quickly expanded into a broader conflict. RAF aircraft, though limited in number, possessed significant operational advantages, including trained crews, established airfields, and mechanical support facilities. Within several days, British airstrikes disrupted Iraqi troop concentrations and supply lines. Iraqi forces attempted to storm the airfield, but were repelled by coordinated artillery and ground fire. Meanwhile, British reinforcements arriving from Basra advanced northward toward Baghdad. During these early engagements, Germany attempted to accelerate its support. The Luftwaffe established a limited deployment known as Sonderkommando Jung, consisting of approximately 20 aircraft, including Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Heinkel He 111 bombers. These aircraft flew from Greece to Syria and then onward to Iraq with Vichy approval. Their arrival in mid-May provided temporary reinforcement for Iraqi efforts, conducting reconnaissance and attacking British columns. However, the small number of aircraft and lack of logistical infrastructure in Iraq severely limited their effectiveness. Mechanical failures, insufficient fuel supplies, and inadequate airfield facilities constrained operations, reducing the mission's ability to influence the overall course of the conflict. British ground forces advanced steadily toward Baghdad, confronting Iraqi units whose training and equipment were insufficient for prolonged warfare against a well-organized expeditionary force. By 29th May, British troops reached the outskirts of the capital. Negotiations followed, leading to the collapse of Rashid Ali's government and the reinstatement of a pro-British administration. Iraqi forces formally ended hostilities, and British command secured key installations, including air bases and oil facilities. The failure of the Iraqi uprising had immediate consequences for all parties involved. For Britain, the rapid stabilization of Iraq ensured the continued operation of critical supply lines and affirmed the effectiveness of its regional command structure. For Germany, the limited impact of its intervention highlighted the challenges of projecting power into the Middle East without secure supply routes or nearby bases. German military planners concluded that only a coordinated campaign involving North Africa, the Balkans, and the Caucasus could create the conditions necessary for meaningful influence in the region. Civilians across Iraq experienced varied effects during the conflict. Some neighborhoods near Baghdad saw fighting that disrupted daily life, while rural areas encountered shortages as supply chains were diverted toward military needs. Political divisions between groups supporting Rashid Ali and those aligned with Britain deepened as a result of the conflict, shaping Iraq's internal dynamics for years to come. The opening phase of Germany's Middle Eastern gamble ended with the defeat of its Iraqi partners and the withdrawal of German aircraft. Yet the episode demonstrated that the region remained strategically important and politically volatile. The conditions created in 1941 laid the foundation for further German attempts to influence events, especially as Axis forces in North Africa moved closer to the Middle Eastern frontier. Germany's strategic planning for deeper involvement in the Middle East developed during mid-1941 as Berlin attempted to reconcile its global ambitions with the practical limitations of geography, logistics, and ongoing operations in Europe. The failed intervention in Iraq had demonstrated both the potential and the constraints of Axis influence in the region. German decision-makers understood that isolated political uprisings could not shift the balance of power unless supported by sustained military pressure. As a result, planning efforts shifted toward a broader, more coordinated strategy involving North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Caucasus. Within the German High Command, multiple proposals emerged. One influential concept, advocated by General Franz Halder and other planners within the Army General Staff, envisioned a combined offensive linking Axis forces in Libya with potential advances through the Caucasus following the launch of Operation Barbarossa. Under this scenario, German and Italian forces in North Africa, reinforced by mechanized divisions, would push eastward toward Egypt and the Suez Canal, while Army Group South advanced toward the oil fields of Baku and northern Iran. These converging offensives could theoretically isolate British power in the Middle East by severing the supply routes connecting the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and India. However, these plans required resources that Germany could not spare. In June 1941, more than 3 million German troops were deployed in the invasion of the Soviet Union, supported by over 600,000 Axis personnel from Allied nations. The logistical demands of Barbarossa consumed enormous quantities of fuel, equipment, and transport capacity. With the Eastern Front absorbing the majority of Germany's military strength, the Middle East remained a secondary theater where only limited resources could be committed. Despite these constraints, the strategic importance of the region motivated continued planning. German intelligence reported that British forces in the Middle East numbered approximately 150,000 to 200,000 troops by mid-1941, including British, Indian, Australian, and local units. These forces were dispersed across Egypt, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq, balancing commitments between internal security, North African operations, and the defense of the Suez Canal. German planners believed that a concentrated Axis offensive concentrating on one or two critical points, such as Tobruk, Alexandria, or the Canal, could force Britain to divert reinforcements from other fronts, including Greece and East Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps played a central role in German calculations. Initially deployed in early 1941 to stabilize Italy's position in Libya, the Africa Corps grew to include 2 armored divisions and supporting units, numbering around 40,000 personnel by late summer. Rommel advocated for an aggressive eastward advance, arguing that capturing Egypt would force Britain to withdraw from its Middle Eastern positions and collapse its Mediterranean supply network. His proposals aligned with Germany's broader geopolitical interests, but clashed with the logistical realities of desert warfare. Fuel supplies had to be shipped from Italy to Libya along routes vulnerable to Royal Navy interdiction, reducing the volume of material that reached Axis forces by 30 to 50%. These shortages limited Germany's ability to commit large formations to sustained operations beyond Cyrenaica. Intelligence assessments shaped strategic thinking on all sides. German analysts studied British defensive preparations in Egypt, including the fortified line at Mersa Matruh and the extensive infrastructure supporting the 8th Army around Cairo and the Canal Zone. They also monitored the movements of the Trans-Iranian Railway, which Britain used to coordinate logistics with the Soviet Union after the German invasion in June 1941. Conversely, British intelligence tracked German communications with nationalist groups in the Middle East and monitored Axis activities in Vichy Syria and Lebanon. Reports indicated that Germany sought additional air transit rights and the extension of supply lines through these territories, but the feasibility of such routes remained uncertain due to political instability and Allied countermeasures. Propaganda became an important component of Germany's strategic planning. Berlin broadcast messages aimed at Arab audiences, emphasizing anti-colonial rhetoric and portraying Axis intervention as support for regional independence movements. These messages were amplified through German Arabic language radio broadcasts, which reported on Axis victories in North Africa and criticized British and French administration of Middle Eastern territories. The impact of these broadcasts varied, with some nationalist factions responding positively while others remained cautious or skeptical of German intentions. Italian strategic goals further complicated the planning process. Rome sought territorial expansion in Egypt and the Horn of Africa, leading to overlapping ambitions with Germany. Italian forces in Libya formed the majority of Axis troops in the region, numbering between 80,000 and 120,000 personnel during mid-1941. Coordination between Italian and German staffs improved over time, but remained inconsistent due to differing operational priorities and command structures. Germany's reliance on Italian logistics and infrastructure further constrained its ability to conduct independent operations in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the civilian populations across the region watched developments with uncertainty. In Egypt, political leaders monitored the shifting balance in the Western Desert as Axis advances threatened urban centers and trade routes. In Iraq and Syria, recent conflicts and the presence of foreign troops heightened tensions. Some communities viewed the prospect of German involvement as a potential path toward greater autonomy, while others feared the destabilizing effects of expanded warfare. By late 1941, Germany's strategic planning for the Middle East had evolved into a multi-pronged approach involving coordination with Axis forces in North Africa, diplomatic engagement with nationalist leaders, and long-term ambitions tied to operations in the Soviet Union. Yet the feasibility of these plans remained tied to conditions on distant fronts. The Middle East represented both a potential opportunity and a logistical challenge, requiring resources and stability that Germany struggled to provide as the war expanded into multiple theaters. The first direct military confrontations linked to Germany's Middle Eastern ambitions unfolded in the interconnected theaters of North Africa, the Levant, and the approaches to the Suez Canal during late 1941 and early 1942. These engagements did not occur within the Middle East proper, but shaped the strategic environment that determined whether German forces could realistically extend operations into the region. As such, the initial clashes reflected not only battlefield dynamics, but also the broader logistical and political constraints faced by both Axis and Allied forces. The Western Desert became the primary arena where the Axis attempted to open a path toward Egypt. After stabilizing the front following Italy's losses in late 1940, Rommel launched a counteroffensive in March 1941 with approximately 50,000 Axis troops, nearly 15,000 German personnel, and the remainder Italian formations equipped with tanks, artillery, and motorized infantry. Against them stood elements of the British Eighth Army, including Australian, New Zealand, Indian, and British brigades totaling around 70,000 troops spread between Cyrenaica and Egypt. The initial German advances were rapid, exploiting gaps created by British withdrawals. Mechanized units captured El Agheila, Brega, and Derna, eventually driving eastward toward the strategic port of Tobruk. Tobruk became the focal point of sustained combat. The town's harbor and defensive perimeter formed a stronghold manned by approximately 24,000 Allied troops, primarily Australian divisions supported by British armor and artillery. Rommel attempted to capture the port to secure supply routes and enable further operations toward Mersa Matruh and the Nile Delta. Initial assaults failed due to strong defensive positions, well-integrated artillery fire, and the defenders' familiarity with the terrain. The siege that followed lasted more than 7 months, tying down Axis forces and demonstrating the difficulty of sustaining an eastward advance without reliable logistical infrastructure. These engagements influenced German prospects in the Middle East in multiple ways. On one hand, Rommel's early successes created concern in Cairo and London, as the possibility of Axis forces reaching the canal appeared credible if the Eighth Army failed to stabilize the front. On the other hand, the prolonged siege of Tobruk revealed the limits of Germany's operational reach. Even with a mechanized force, Rommel's supply lines depended on deliveries through Tripoli, a port with limited capacity and vulnerable to British naval and air attacks. Losses during transport often exceeded 1/3 of all dispatch materiel, constraining the Afrika Korps' ability to maintain offensive momentum. Beyond North Africa, the Levant became another arena of early confrontation relevant to Germany's regional aims. In June 1941, following concerns that Vichy-controlled Syria and Lebanon could provide airfields or transit routes for German aircraft, Britain and Free French forces launched Operation Exporter. Approximately 34,000 Allied troops advanced from Palestine and Transjordan, while Vichy forces, numbering around 35,000 personnel, mounted resistance supported by aircraft and mechanized units. The month-long campaign resulted in Allied control of the region, preventing its use as a corridor for further German air operations toward Iraq or beyond. For Germany, the loss of potential air transit rights in Syria further limited the feasibility of sustained intervention in the Middle East. Meanwhile, British forces in Iraq continued securing key installations following the defeat of the Rashid Ali government. RAF Habaniya and bases near Mosul and Basra allowed the British to patrol the region and monitor Axis activities. Reinforcement of the Trans-Iranian Corridor, shared with Soviet forces after August 1941, increased logistical stability for the Allies, enabling the movement of supplies into the Soviet Union and strengthening regional defenses. These developments reduced the likelihood that Germany could exploit internal unrest or political upheaval in Iraq or Iran in the near term. The Mediterranean naval theater further shaped the early clashes affecting German prospects in the Middle East. The Royal Navy maintained substantial control over the sea lanes connecting Alexandria, Haifa, and Cyprus. Axis supply convoys to Libya faced constant threats from submarines, aircraft, and surface vessels. During several months in 1941 and 1942, average monthly Axis shipping losses reached 20 to 30%, materially impacting operations in the desert. Without secure logistical channels, even victories on land could not translate into sustained advances toward the Middle Eastern interior. Civilians across these regions experienced the consequences of the shifting front lines. In Libya, population centers near Tobruk and Benghazi saw evacuations and disruptions as Allied and Axis forces alternated control. In Syria and Lebanon, the brief but intense fighting affected transportation networks, agricultural production, and local governance. Communities in Palestine and Egypt tracked developments anxiously, recognizing that changes in control over the Western Desert could shape regional stability or lead to expanded conflict across the Middle East. Morale fluctuated on both sides. Axis troops, encouraged by initial successes, viewed the campaign as proof of the feasibility of a broader advance into Egypt. However, the protracted nature of the fighting and repeated supply shortages tempered these expectations. Allied troops, though stretched thin across multiple theaters, benefited from strong supply lines and the ability to rotate units from India, South Africa, and Australia, providing operational resilience. By the end of 1941, the first engagements had demonstrated that Germany's path into the Middle East would depend less on isolated victories and more on the ability to overcome substantial logistical and political barriers. The clashes in North Africa and the Levant set the stage for a larger, more sustained struggle whose outcome would dictate whether Germany could extend its influence into the heart of the Middle Eastern strategic corridor. The escalation of the conflict in 1942 pushed Germany's Middle Eastern ambitions to their most critical point as fighting in North Africa intensified and new political pressures emerged across the region. The period from January to November 1942 marked the closest Germany and its Axis partners came to projecting sustained military influence toward the Middle East. It also exposed the structural limitations, logistical, operational, and diplomatic, that ultimately constrained their ability to alter the region's strategic balance. In early 1942, Axis forces in North Africa received reinforcements intended to restore operational momentum. The arrival of the Italian Ariete Armored Division and the German 91st Light Division increased Axis strength in Libya to approximately 110,000 personnel, including over 500 operational tanks and assault guns. British forces, reorganized under the 8th Army, fielded around 150,000 troops with a larger armored complement, but were dispersed across the Western Desert and recent defensive positions in Egypt. Both sides prepared for renewed offensives, recognizing that control of the desert corridor would determine access to the Middle East. The first major escalation occurred in January with Rommel's counteroffensive from El Agheila. Axis mechanized units advanced rapidly, recapturing Benghazi on the 29th of January and pushing the 8th Army back toward the Gazala line. This advance increased German confidence in the feasibility of reaching Egypt and potentially threatening the Suez Canal. British command, aware of the strategic consequences of losing the canal, reinforced with additional Indian and South African brigades and increased RAF patrols over coastal supply routes. Despite these measures, Axis forces maintained momentum through February and March, consolidating control over Cyrenaica and preparing for a decisive confrontation. The crisis deepened in May 1942 with the launch of the Battle of Gazala, one of the largest engagements in the North African campaign. Rommel deployed approximately 90,000 troops, including 560 tanks, against British forces totaling around 100,000 personnel with over 800 tanks. The battle unfolded across a 60-kilometer-wide defensive line, supported by minefields, fortified positions, and artillery. German and Italian armored divisions executed wide flanking maneuvers, eventually encircling several British brigades. By mid-June, the Axis had captured Tobruk, along with 33,000 Allied prisoners, substantial supplies, and a strategic port that temporarily eased logistical pressures. This victory represented the high point of German prospects for entering the Middle East, as it opened the route toward Egypt and strongly affected regional perceptions of Axis strength. However, this success also highlighted growing vulnerabilities. The rapid advance strained Axis supply lines, which now extended more than 1,500 kilometers from Tripoli. Fuel shortages intensified as Allied air and naval forces disrupted convoys crossing the Mediterranean. In June alone, more than 20% of Axis shipping bound for North Africa was sunk, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement vehicles could not keep pace with operational needs. When Axis forces advanced into Egypt in July, their numbers had diminished significantly. Rommel's combined strength had fallen to approximately 75,000 men, and fewer than 300 tanks, while the Eighth Army, reinforced by fresh British, New Zealand, and Indian divisions, numbered around 170,000 personnel with more than 900 operational tanks. The confrontation at the First Battle of El Alamein halted the Axis advance. British defensive positions anchored on Ruisat Ridge and the Katara Depression limited maneuver space, while RAF air superiority restricted Axis reconnaissance and interdicted supply lines. The battle stabilized the front and prevented further eastward movement toward the canal. The crisis intensified during late summer as both sides endured attrition across the desert. German and Italian units reported shortages of fuel, artillery shells, and medical supplies. The Afrika Corps' armored strength declined steadily due to losses and mechanical breakdowns, often leaving battalions with fewer than 20 operational tanks. British command, meanwhile, received increased logistical support from India, South Africa, and the United States. The arrival of American M4 Sherman tanks improved Allied armored performance, and reinforcements raised Eighth Army strength to over 195,000 troops by October. These developments converged during the Second Battle of El Alamein, launched on October 23, 1942. The British Eighth Army deployed approximately 195,000 personnel, 1,000 tanks, and 900 artillery pieces. Axis forces fielded around 116,000 troops, with approximately 540 tanks and self-propelled guns, though many units operated at reduced strength. The battle's intensity exceeded earlier engagements, with sustained artillery fire and repeated armored clashes. Axis defensive lines collapsed after 2 weeks of fighting. By early November, German and Italian units began a general withdrawal across Libya, eventually abandoning key positions, including Benghazi and the desert corridors that might have opened a route into the Middle East. Beyond the battlefield, political escalation unfolded in Iran and Turkey. British and Soviet occupation of Iran in August 1941 ensured control over the Persian corridor, limiting German opportunities to influence events there. Turkey remained neutral, but monitored developments cautiously, refusing repeated German overtures for military transit or alliance. Meanwhile, Arab nationalist movements in Iraq, Syria, and Palestine recalibrated their positions, following Axis setbacks, recognizing that Germany's ability to support regional uprisings had diminished. Civilians across North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean experienced the direct consequences of the conflict's escalation. Disrupted food supplies, damaged infrastructure, and mass displacement affected communities near the front lines. In Egypt, urban populations tracked the approach of Axis forces with concern, while agricultural regions near the Delta faced requisitioning from British units preparing for defensive operations. By the end of 1942, the crisis phase of Germany's Middle Eastern gamble had reached its limit. The combination of overextended supply lines, Allied material advantages, and the inability to secure decisive breakthroughs prevented the Axis from capitalizing on earlier successes. The trajectory of the campaign now shifted toward defensive operations and eventual withdrawal, marking the beginning of a strategic reversal that would shape the subsequent phases of the war in the region. The peak of Germany's Middle Eastern gamble emerged during mid-1942, when Axis forces stood closer to Egypt and thus to the strategic gateways of the Middle East than at any other point in the war. This phase represented the culmination of months of maneuver warfare, supply struggles, and political calculations. Yet it also revealed the structural limits of Axis power in a region where geography, logistics, and material asymmetry increasingly dictated outcomes. The largest operations unfolded along the North African coast, but their implications extended across the Middle East, influencing Allied decision-making from Cairo to Baghdad, and shaping German hopes of destabilizing British control over the region's oil fields and transport corridors. By late June 1942, following the capture of Tobruk, Axis forces reached the apex of their offensive capability. Rommel commanded approximately 113,000 troops, of whom roughly 52,000 were German and the remainder Italian, supported by around 560 operational tanks and self-propelled guns. Their rapid movement eastward triggered a significant British response. The Eighth Army, reorganizing after the setback at Gazala, assembled more than 150,000 troops along the defensive lines west of El Alamein, with approximately 900 tanks, including newly delivered M3 and M4 models that offered technical advantages over many Axis armored vehicles. The concentration of forces on both sides created one of the largest mechanized confrontations in the Desert War. The peak intensity of operations began with Axis attempts to breach the El Alamein defenses during early July. The terrain itself played a decisive role. Between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression, a corridor no wider than 60 kilometers limited maneuver freedom, forcing both sides into frontal engagements rather than the sweeping flanking movements that had characterized earlier stages of the campaign. Minefields, fortified boxes, and overlapping artillery zones further constrained operations. German and Italian units launched repeated assaults on positions such as Ruisat, Ridge, and Tel El Asa, seeking to disrupt British defensive cohesion. British counterattacks prevented deeper penetrations, inflicting losses that Axis logistics struggled to replace. The scale of the fighting produced significant equipment attrition. On several days in July, German armored units reported operational tank strength dropping by more than 30% due to mechanical failures and combat losses. British formations also sustained heavy damage, but compensated through a steady flow of replacements arriving from Alexandria and the Suez Canal zone. RAF activity intensified as well. Approximately 500 operational aircraft from the Desert Air Force conducted interdiction missions against Axis convoys, ammunition dumps, and assembly areas. In contrast, the Luftwaffe in North Africa operated with fewer than 150 serviceable aircraft due to supply shortages and the redirection of air assets to the Eastern Front. The civilian impact of the campaign's peak phase extended across Egypt and Libya. In Alexandria and Cairo, air raid precautions became routine, and authorities prepared evacuation contingencies in case Axis forces approached the Nile Delta. Ports along the coast saw increased military traffic, including troop transports, hospital ships, and supply convoys from India, South Africa, and the United States. In Libya, communities near Benghazi, Derna, and Tobruk faced repeated displacement as the front shifted. Agricultural production declined due to abandoned farmland, and water distribution networks suffered from shelling and military requisitioning. The political dimension of the campaign also reached peak intensity. British command in the region underwent changes, including the appointment of General Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief Middle East, and Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery as Commander of the Eighth Army. These leadership adjustments brought doctrinal shifts emphasizing deliberate preparation, concentrated firepower, and the restoration of morale across frontline units. Germany, meanwhile, continued diplomatic engagement with nationalist factions in the region. However, Axis political influence diminished as it became clear that battlefield momentum alone could not guarantee entry into the Middle East without secure supply corridors and sustained reinforcement. One of the most consequential features of the campaign's peak was the widening gap between tactical success and strategic feasibility for the Axis. Although German units demonstrated high mobility and battlefield coordination, their supply situation deteriorated rapidly. Fuel shipments across the Mediterranean decreased as Allied naval and air forces intensified interdiction efforts. In some months of 1942, only 50 to 60% of dispatched Axis supplies reached Libyan ports. This shortfall directly reduced the duration and intensity of mechanized operations, limiting the ability of Axis forces to exploit breakthroughs or maintain continuous pressure on British lines. The culmination of the peak phase occurred in August and September 1942, when both sides prepared for decisive engagements. British forces constructed additional defensive belts, repositioned artillery, and integrated American Lend-Lease equipment into frontline units. Axis forces consolidated their remaining armored strength near the Alam el Halfa Ridge, attempting a final maneuver intended to break the British line. The resulting battle, fought from 30 August to 5 September, marked a turning point within the peak phase itself. Axis forces advanced with roughly 240 operational tanks into a system of British minefields and pre-sighted artillery zones. After several days of heavy fighting, German and Italian units withdrew with diminished fuel stocks and reduced armored strength, while British forces held their positions with comparatively lower losses. Although fighting continued across October, the Alam el Halfa engagement effectively marked the highest point of Germany's operational reach toward the Middle East. The battle exposed the limits imposed by logistics, geography, and the growing material advantage of the Allies. For the civilian population of Egypt, the stabilization of the front offered temporary relief from the fear of invasion, while in Libya, the continued Axis presence prolonged displacement and hardship. By the end of this period, Germany's gamble in the Middle East stood at a crossroads. Operational ambition had reached its maximum extent, but the structural conditions needed for strategic victory were absent. The next phase would reveal how these pressures shaped the Axis transition from offensive ambitions to defensive survival across the North African and Middle Eastern corridor. As the momentum of the North African campaign shifted during late 1942, both Axis and Allied forces entered a period defined by adaptation, improvised strategies, and sustained resistance across the desert corridor leading toward the Middle East. While Germany's ambition to push toward Egypt and beyond confronted structural constraints, the period between September and November 1942 demonstrated how each side attempted to compensate for earlier losses and operational shortfalls. This phase illustrates the tactical ingenuity, logistical improvisation, and psychological strain that shaped the conduct of armies fighting in an environment where extended supply lines, extreme climate, and fluctuating force strength dictated every decision. Following the engagement at Alam el Halfa, Axis command recognized that further large-scale offensive operations were increasingly untenable without improved supply conditions. German and Italian units adapted by reorganizing their depleted armored formations into smaller, more flexible battle groups. Several panzer regiments operated at less than 40% of authorized tank strength, often fielding fewer than 20 operational vehicles. Workshops attempted to restore damaged tanks using salvage parts from abandoned or destroyed British equipment. Fuel scarcity compelled the Africa Corps to reduce non-essential vehicle movement, limiting patrols and reconnaissance missions. Artillery units rationed shells, sometimes limiting fire to counter-battery engagements or defensive barrages. British forces, adapting from earlier defensive posture, implemented extensive retraining programs aimed at restoring unit cohesion and morale. New Zealand, South African, Indian, and British brigades conducted combined arms exercises along the Nile Delta and the Alam el Halfa front, practicing coordinated infantry tank maneuvers and artillery spotting. The 8th Army introduced new communications protocols to correct previous coordination failures experienced during Gazala. The arrival of additional American M4 Shermans and M7 Priest self-propelled guns increased mobility and firepower across several divisions. These innovations prepared the 8th Army for a more assertive operational approach, setting the stage for a large-scale offensive later in the year. Resistance also emerged in civilian and irregular forms across the wider Middle Eastern theater. In Libya, local communities provided intelligence to British reconnaissance units regarding Axis troop movements, supply depots, and minefield locations. In Egypt, police forces and auxiliary units assisted British command in securing key transport routes between Alexandria, Cairo, and the Canal Zone. Meanwhile, in Iraq and Syria, areas under British control since 1941, authorities monitored pro-Axis sympathies within certain nationalist groups, attempting to prevent uprisings that could disrupt supply lines to the Persian corridor. Though no large-scale insurgency emerged, the political tension underscored how events in North Africa shaped broader regional dynamics. Axis adaptation also took diplomatic and intelligence forms. German agents operating in Turkey and Iran continued efforts to encourage political figures to distance themselves from British influence. However, Tehran's occupation by British and Soviet forces since 1941 limited German activity in Iran. Turkey maintained its neutrality, but strengthened border defenses and monitored developments closely. German hopes that victories in Egypt might persuade Ankara to join the Axis diminished as logistical setbacks grew more visible. Internal German intelligence assessments produced in autumn 1942 warned that even if the Suez Canal were reached, holding territory across the Middle East without secure maritime supply routes would pose significant operational risks. Operational adaptation on the British side intensified through improvements in logistics. The Eighth Army reorganized its supply network, establishing forward depots closer to the front and increasing reliance on motorized convoys supported by engineering units capable of repairing desert tracks. The proximity of the canal zone allowed rapid unloading of equipment transported from India, South Africa, and the United States. This logistical advantage became increasingly decisive. British armored divisions could undertake sustained operations with fuel reserves sometimes exceeding 5 times the stocks available to the Axis. The result was a growing disparity in operational tempo that would later influence the outcome of the El Alamein offensive. Morale fluctuated sharply across both sides during this period. German units, though motivated by discipline and previous successes, recorded rising fatigue due to continuous operations, harsh environmental conditions, and declining supplies. Diaries from several Axis divisions noted reductions in daily rations and limited medical supplies. Italian troops, operating under similar constraints, experienced particularly severe shortages of water and transport vehicles. On the British side, morale improved significantly after the halt of the Axis advance into Egypt. Reinforced training programs, leadership changes, and increasing material superiority created confidence that a major counteroffensive could succeed. Adaptation also manifested in intelligence operations. British code-breaking at Bletchley Park continued to decrypt German communications transmitted via the Enigma network, providing detailed insight into Axis supply shortages, unit strength, and planned troop movements. This intelligence informed British decisions on where and when to apply pressure along the front. Conversely, Axis intelligence suffered from reduced reconnaissance capability due to limited aircraft availability and the inability to maintain consistent aerial patrols over British staging areas. As the weeks progressed, both sides braced for a decisive confrontation. German command sought to strengthen defensive positions along a series of ridges and minefields west of El Alamein, anticipating that the British would soon attempt a breakthrough. Engineers constructed fortified boxes, laid extensive mine belts, and positioned anti-tank guns along likely avenues of attack. British command, meanwhile, prepared for Operation Lightfoot, the opening phase of a planned offensive intended to penetrate Axis minefields and encircle key armored formations. Exercises involving more than 1,000 tanks and artillery pieces rehearsed coordinated advances across carefully mapped corridors. By late October 1942, resistance and adaptation on both sides had reached their limits. Axis forces demonstrated remarkable endurance and tactical ingenuity, despite severe shortages, while British forces transformed themselves into a more cohesive and mobile fighting force prepared for sustained offensive operations. The stage was set for a decisive shift in the campaign, one that would determine the viability of Germany's broader vision for influence in the Middle East and reshape the strategic balance across the region. The turning point in Germany's attempt to project power toward the Middle East emerged during the final months of 1942, when the cumulative pressures of logistics, attrition, and shifting operational balance converged in the decisive battles around El Alamein. This phase did not consist of a single moment, but rather a sustained sequence of military, political, and logistical developments that gradually eroded the Axis ability to continue offensive operations. The result was a transformation of the North African campaign from a contest over the Middle East's strategic gateways into a controlled Allied effort to regain initiative across the entire region. The decisive shift began with the launch of the British Eighth Army's offensive at El Alamein on 23 October 1942. Operation Lightfoot, the opening phase, involved approximately 195,000 British, New Zealand, Australian, Indian, South African, and Free French troops, supported by more than 1,000 tanks, 900 artillery pieces, and a substantial air fleet. Axis forces, consisting of roughly 116,000 troops and around 540 tanks and self-propelled guns, defended a network of minefields, fortified positions, and anti-tank gun emplacements. The disparity in supply levels, equipment readiness, and fuel reserves shaped the battle even before engagements began. British units maintained fuel reserves sufficient for weeks of continuous combat, while Axis fuel stocks were estimated to cover only a fraction of the same duration. Operation Lightfoot aimed to clear two main corridors through Axis minefields, enabling armored divisions to break into open terrain behind defensive lines. The first days of the operation involved intense artillery exchanges, with British guns firing tens of thousands of shells against Axis frontline positions. Infantry divisions advanced through mine belts under concentrated machine gun and anti-tank fire, sustaining significant casualties. German and Italian units resisted effectively in several sectors, forcing British engineers to adjust clearing routes repeatedly. Nevertheless, the British maintained pressure, gradually widening footholds along the front. The attrition experienced during the initial week of fighting created conditions that reduced Axis options for counteroffensive action. Panzer divisions, already operating below authorized strength, saw their operational tank numbers fall sharply due to combat losses and the inability to receive replacements. By the start of November, some regiments reported fewer than 20 serviceable armored vehicles. Artillery units rationed ammunition, limiting their ability to counter sustained British barrages. The Luftwaffe flew fewer sorties than the Desert Air Force, restricted by shortages of fuel and replacement aircraft. British air forces executed hundreds of sorties daily, targeting supply dumps, motor pools, and troop concentrations deep behind the lines. The decisive breakthrough occurred during Operation Supercharge, launched on November 2, 1942. Concentrating more than 400 tanks and several infantry brigades, the Eighth Army struck along the northern axis, aiming to split German and Italian forces and force a withdrawal. Axis anti-tank defenses inflicted heavy losses, but the British advance succeeded in overwhelming key defensive nodes, including the positions held by the Italian Ariete and Trieste divisions. The collapse of several Italian formations created gaps that German units were unable to fill due to insufficient reserves. Reports from the Africa Corps indicated that fuel shortages were preventing effective maneuvering, with some battle groups receiving only enough fuel for a single major repositioning. On November 4th, Rommel ordered a general withdrawal toward Fuka and later toward the Libyan frontier. The withdrawal represented a critical turning point because it eliminated any remaining possibility of reaching Egypt or threatening the Middle East. It also initiated a chain reaction that unraveled the entire Axis position in North Africa. The Eighth Army pursued along the coast road and desert tracks, capturing large quantities of abandoned equipment and thousands of prisoners. Between 4 and 11 November, German and Italian losses included over 400 tanks destroyed or abandoned and more than 30,000 troops captured. British casualties, though substantial, were offset by continuous reinforcement from the Canal Zone. The turning point extended beyond North Africa when Allied forces under Operation Torch landed in Morocco and Algeria on November 8, 1942. Approximately 107,000 American and British troops established beachheads along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts, opening a second front in the western part of North Africa. The combined pressure from Torch in the west and Eighth Army in the east placed Axis forces in an unsustainable position. The German High Command acknowledged that reinforcement of North Africa to levels needed for recovery was impossible due to naval losses in the Mediterranean, competing demands from the Eastern Front, and a growing shortage of transport vessels. As Axis forces retreated across Libya, the consequences for the civilian population grew more pronounced. Towns such as Tobruk, Derna, and Benghazi changed hands repeatedly, resulting in disruptions to food distribution, property damage, and the displacement of thousands of inhabitants. British civil affairs units attempted to restore basic services in recaptured areas, but the speed of operations and the scale of damage limited effectiveness. In Egypt, the stabilization of the front and subsequent British advance reduced the immediate threat to urban centers, though rationing and air raid precautions remained in effect. The political repercussions of the turning point were felt across the Middle East. States such as Turkey and Iran recalibrated their assessments of German prospects, strengthening ties with the Allies and reducing diplomatic contact with Axis representatives. In the Arab world, nationalist leaders who had previously explored German support concluded that German influence would not expand into the region. British authorities capitalized on this shift by reinforcing economic agreements and security arrangements in Iraq, Egypt, and the Persian Gulf. By December 1942, the turning point was complete. Germany's capacity to pursue strategic objectives in the Middle East had been decisively curtailed. The failures at El Alamein, combined with the effects of Operation Torch, forced the Axis into a defensive posture from which recovery proved impossible. What began as a calculated gamble to reshape the regional balance of power ended with a withdrawal that redefined the trajectory of the war in North Africa and the Middle East. The aftermath of Germany's failed attempt to reach the Middle East unfolded rapidly between late 1942 and early 1943, as Axis forces retreated westward across Libya and eventually into Tunisia. This stage represented not only the end of large-scale combat operations aimed at threatening Egypt, the Suez Canal, or the broader Middle Eastern oil network, but also the collapse of the logistical and strategic foundations that had once made such ambitions appear viable. The retreat, characterized by a series of defensive actions, evacuations, and territorial losses, reshaped the civilian and military landscape across North Africa, and signaled the definitive end of the Axis gamble in the region. After the withdrawal from El Alamein, Axis forces moved along the coastal road in a series of staged defensive lines intended to slow the British advance. By mid-November 1942, the Africa Corps and Italian divisions consolidated around Mirza Matruh, deploying approximately 60,000 troops with fewer than 100 operational tanks. British strength exceeded 170,000 personnel, supported by over 600 tanks and an expanding air fleet. Axis attempts to halt the British advance at Mirza Matruh and later at Bardia and Sollum were hindered by fuel shortages and diminished artillery capabilities. British forces, benefiting from secure supply lines and consistent reinforcement, outpaced retreating Axis columns and captured thousands of prisoners during each engagement. As the Axis retreated into Libya, the humanitarian impact increased significantly. Repeated battles around Tobruk, Derna, and Benghazi left infrastructure damaged or destroyed, water pipelines ruptured, power stations ceased functioning, and supply depots burned or abandoned, contributed to widespread shortages for local populations. Civilians experienced disruptions in food distribution, difficulty accessing medical care, and displacement as towns changed hands multiple times. British civil affairs officers began coordinating relief efforts in recaptured areas, but the rapid pace of operations limited the extent of early reconstruction. By December 1942, Axis forces reached the defensive positions around El Agheila. Here, they hoped to regroup and stabilize the front. However, the British Eighth Army, maintaining pressure across a 1,200-kilometer advance from Egypt, attacked the position on December 15th. Axis units, unable to hold under sustained artillery fire and air attacks, withdrew toward Tripoli. During this phase, German and Italian commanders faced acute shortages. Estimates recorded fuel reserves at approximately 30% of the minimum required for sustained defensive operations. Some armored units operated with fewer than 10 serviceable tanks, while infantry divisions reported significant attrition from exposure, lack of medical supplies, and continuous marching. In the broader region, the consequences of the Axis retreat influenced strategic calculations. British and American forces strengthening positions in Iraq, Syria, and the Persian Gulf faced decreasing risk of Axis-supported uprisings or incursions. The Persian Corridor, central to the Allied supply effort toward the Soviet Union, experienced uninterrupted operation from late 1942 onward, with monthly shipments rising to over 100,000 tons by early 1943. Turkish neutrality began to tilt more explicitly toward the Allied side as Ankara assessed the declining German position and increased diplomatic engagement with London and Washington. The final phase of withdrawal occurred in January 1943, when Axis forces abandoned Tripoli. British troops entered the city on the 23rd of January, capturing substantial stores of equipment left behind by retreating units. The evacuation of Tripoli's civilian population during the preceding weeks had strained limited transport networks, and British authorities found the port heavily damaged by demolitions intended to slow Allied occupation. Despite these obstacles, the fall of Tripoli marked the end of organized Axis control in Libya, eliminating any remaining logistical base for operations aimed at the Middle East. Axis forces continued withdrawing toward Tunisia, where reinforcements from Europe had begun arriving following Operation Torch. By February 1943, approximately 120,000 Axis troops were concentrated in the Tunisian bridgehead, including German Afrika Korps remnants and newly deployed German and Italian units. While this force represented a substantial concentration of manpower, the strategic situation made further operations toward the Middle East impossible. The distance from Tunis to Egypt exceeded 2,000 kilometers, and Allied control of the central Mediterranean limited Axis' ability to transport fuel, ammunition, and aircraft at the scale required for large offensive actions. The humanitarian effects of the retreat continued throughout this period. In Libya, agricultural production declined sharply. Local markets struggled to re-establish themselves due to the destruction of transport routes and the scarcity of imported goods. Medical facilities relied heavily on limited British supplies to treat both military and civilian casualties. In Egypt, the easing of invasion fears allowed gradual restoration of normal activity in Alexandria and Cairo, although wartime rationing and air raid precautions remained in place. The immediate consequences for the Axis were profound. The loss of North African territories eliminated Germany's and Italy's ability to threaten the Suez Canal or contest British control over Middle Eastern oil fields. It forced the diversion of German resources to Tunisia in an attempt to delay Allied control of the central Mediterranean, reducing flexibility in other theaters. For the Allies, the retreat opened the path for coordinated Anglo-American operations aimed at capturing Tunisia and preparing for the invasion of southern Europe. By March 1943, the strategic situation shaped by the retreat and withdrawal was clear. Germany's Middle Eastern ambitions had ended, and the region was firmly beyond Axis reach. What remained were the political, economic, and humanitarian challenges of reconstruction in North Africa, alongside preparations for the final phase of the North African campaign that would conclude in Tunisia. The next stage would reveal how these developments reshaped the global balance of the war and permanently closed the chapter on Axis efforts to reach the Middle East. The long-term legacy of Germany's failed attempt to extend its influence into the Middle East cannot be understood solely through military outcomes. The consequences unfolded across political, economic, and cultural domains, reshaping strategic thinking and regional alignments for years after the North African campaign ended in 1943. The collapse of Axis ambitions in the region marked not only the end of a specific military operation, but the conclusion of a geopolitical contest that had spanned multiple theaters from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The effects of this defeat influenced Allied wartime planning, post-war regional structures, and the ways in which Middle Eastern populations interpreted the power dynamics of the global conflict. In the immediate post-campaign period, the most visible legacy lay in the transformation of strategic priorities. For the Allies, the restoration of secure control over the Suez Canal, the Levant, and the Persian Corridor ensured uninterrupted logistical routes. These routes carried more than 5 million tons of war materiel between 1942 and 1945, supporting operations on the Eastern Front and in Southeast Asia. The success of the British Eighth Army and American forces in North Africa reinforced the importance of combined operations and multinational logistics networks, influencing planning for later operations, including the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Military studies produced after the campaign emphasized how logistics, air superiority, and maritime interdiction, not numerical troop strength alone, determined the viability of long-range operations across desert environments. For Germany, the failed Middle Eastern strategy highlighted structural vulnerabilities that extended beyond North Africa. The inability to sustain supply lines across the Mediterranean, the shortage of fuel, and the diversion of air and naval resources to other fronts demonstrated the limits of Axis strategic reach. Post-war analyses by German commanders consistently identified the Mediterranean supply crisis as a decisive factor. Several evaluations noted that even a successful advance into Egypt would likely have overextended Axis forces beyond resupply capacity, raising questions about the feasibility of the broader strategic vision. These assessments influenced Cold War military studies, where analysts used the North African campaign to illustrate the risks associated with extended operations without secure shipping lanes. The political impact in the Middle East was equally significant. The failure of the Axis to penetrate the region ended hopes among certain nationalist groups that external intervention might accelerate independence movements or weaken British authority. In Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, political leaders adjusted strategies to work within the evolving British and later American spheres of influence. Iranian politics shifted after the 1941 occupation, and the stabilization of Middle Eastern supply routes strengthened Allied diplomatic leverage in Tehran. Turkey, witnessing the shift in military fortunes after El Alamein and Operation Torch, moved closer to the Allies diplomatically, culminating in a break of relations with Germany in August 1944. Culturally, the campaign left a complex imprint across the region. Populations who had lived for months under the possibility of invasion, particularly in Egypt and Libya, retained vivid memories of military occupations, evacuations, and disrupted livelihoods. In Libya, the repeated movement of front lines created long-term challenges for reconstruction. Mines and unexploded ordnance remained hazards for decades, affecting agriculture and settlement patterns. Oral histories collected after the war documented how communities adapted to the presence of large military forces and how political identities were shaped by the war's shifting power balances. In Europe, the Middle Eastern dimension of the North African campaign became a subject of historical debate. Some interpretations emphasized the strategic value of the region's oil reserves, while others highlighted the broader geopolitical implications of controlling the Suez Canal and Mediterranean sea lanes. Military historians examined whether alternative German strategies, such as prioritizing the Mediterranean over the Eastern Front, could have yielded different outcomes. However, consensus formed around the conclusion that without maritime access, secure supply routes, and sustained logistical support, the Middle Eastern strategy lacked the structural conditions necessary for long-term success. The campaign also influenced the post-war military doctrines of several nations. British studies of the Desert War underscored the effectiveness of integrating air-ground operations, a principle later adopted widely by NATO. American analysts examined how Operation Torch demonstrated the potential of amphibious landings supported by multinational task forces. German studies focused on the consequences of fuel shortages and the challenges of sustaining mechanized operations under heavy interdiction. These analyses informed early Cold War planning as powers sought to understand how mobile warfare could function across vast, resource-scarce regions. Memory and commemoration became additional elements of the campaign's legacy. Commonwealth cemeteries across Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia marked the resting places of thousands of soldiers from Britain, India, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. German and Italian war graves, maintained through post-war agreements, reflected the multinational character of the Axis presence. Annual remembrance ceremonies highlighted the global nature of the conflict and the diverse origins of the forces engaged in the North African and Middle Eastern theaters. Perhaps the most enduring historical significance lies in how the failure of Germany's Middle Eastern ambitions shaped the post-war regional order. Allied control during the critical years of 1942 to 1943 ensured that British and later American influence remained dominant in the Middle East. enabling post-war political arrangements that shaped the early Cold War. The security of oil production and shipping routes contributed to the reconstruction of Europe and the global economic order. The outcome of the campaign also influenced decolonization movements, as wartime cooperation and shifting power structures altered political expectations across the region. By the late 20th century, historians viewed the North African campaign not merely as a conflict over desert terrain, but as a crucial moment in the global struggle to control the political and economic arteries of the Middle East. The legacy of Germany's failed gamble persisted in military studies, diplomatic archives, regional memory, and global geopolitics. It demonstrated how strategic ambitions can be constrained by geography, logistics, and the cumulative effects of coordinated multinational resistance. Through these enduring consequences, the campaign continues to shape understanding of the wider conflict and its long-term influence on the Middle East and beyond.